ridiculed, saying them, they're just drunk, that's all. When was the last time you were accused of being drunk because you were empowered by the Holy Spirit? It's kind of an interesting thought. When Peter stepped forward with the 11 other apostles and shouted to the crowd, "Listen carefully, all of you, fellow Jews and residents of Jerusalem. Make no mistake about this. These people are not drunk, as some of you are assuming. 9 o'clock in the morning is much too early for that. No, what you see was predicted long ago by the prophet Joel." These are the words of Joel. "In the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit upon all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. In those days, I will pour out my Spirit, even on my servants, men and women alike. And they will prophesy, and I will cause wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and clouds of smoke. The sun will become dark, and the moon will turn blood red before that great and glorious day of the Lord arrives. But everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You know, when I read this story, one of the incredible things to me about this story is not only that the Spirit comes. That's incredible by itself that the Spirit comes. But it's what the Spirit does. See, all of a sudden we see everyone being able to understand their own language. But you see, this Pentecost, it's not as much about reuniting all the languages and cultures. It's more about how it can be understood and witnessed in diversity. See, if I remember in my year-end address that we shared on our last Sunday in our annual church meeting, I shared how we go back to that story of the Tower of Babel and how God scattered men because they tried to make themselves great. See, it's supposed to be God who makes us great. And he does that by us obeying and then by us scattering out into the world. And that is us obeying, is being sent and going out. And then he makes us great. See, this is done possible not by all of mankind being able to understand one another, but by everyone being able to understand God. See, that's the difference. It's not about us being able to understand each other. It's about us being able to understand him. See, if you haven't noticed in life, God does things a little different than how we would or how we even could. He does things just a little differently. Sometimes we're like, well, we sometimes even struggle, sometimes seeing the difference. It's not sometimes just not even knowing the difference. Sometimes it's just a struggle to see the difference between the two of them. These were kind of going, well, doesn't that achieve the same thing? No. The means do not always justify, the end does not always justify the means. See, God, it's the way we do things is important to him as well. See, this power and purpose of God, it passes all human man-made boundaries. It surpasses all human man-made mentalities and structures and constructs and mentalities. See, we see here in Acts, we see the beginning of a universal evangelism. We see Joel's prophecy from hundreds of years before come true in Pentecost. We see this. He says right here, it says, in the last days, God says he's going to pour out his Spirit. He poured out his Spirit. The sons and daughters are going to prophesy. There was prophesying. Young men will see visions. There was visions. There were dreams. And it was men and women alike. See, this prophecy of Joel's, it crossed all barriers of age, of gender. It crossed our social statuses. For them, it would have been, it crossed the barriers of free or slave. For us in this world and in our country, we would sit there and say our economical, social status. It breaks every one of those things. It says everyone in that passage, not just the ones that we pick, not just the ones that we're comfortable with, the ones that, I can hang around that person. They don't smell too bad. They don't curse too much. They don't drink too much. They aren't too rough around the edges. I can be. It says everyone. See, this isn't new at Pentecost, though. That's the incredible thing. It wasn't Pentecost that this began. If we actually go back to the first part of Luke's story, we go back to the Gospel of Luke, because, Acts is just the second act. Second act. It's the second act. Luke, and it flows, the story just continues on to the book of Acts. We see that God was already speaking through both genders and all ages, even before Pentecost. See, Luke chapter 2, verse 36 tells us of Anna, a prophet. It wasn't brand new. There were women that were prophets before the Holy Spirit came. And we see this even continue on. Nothing changes, because later on in Acts chapter 2, we see a man with 4 daughters who had the gift of prophecy, as well as a man that did as well. We see that the Spirit, that God is at work, and that God crosses the boundaries. God crosses the lines. God's Spirit speaks to all and empowers believers together, regardless of ethnicity, class, or gender, to come together and partner in this mission, to partner in His mission. See, Acts chapter 2 tells us that all the believers were together. Remember, they were in that, we say they were in that upper room. We're really not completely sure on all the details. We just do know that all the believers were together. That does not mean that it was only the 12. Sometimes we sit there and think, it was just the disciples, it was the apostles. No, not necessarily. It says believers. And so it was maybe more than 12. In fact, Peter's speech that follows after this account in Acts, it affirms that the Spirit empowers all people. It wasn't reserved just for a select few. It wasn't reserved for just the leaders, like it was some mantle that only the leaders got to receive. It wasn't one of those Elijah or Elisha moments. It was something that was open for all. And so we continue to see this beautiful picture of what happens when people come together on equal terms to share equally in what God desires. See, let me say that. Did you notice there's a lot of word there? We come together on equal terms to share equally in what God desires. It doesn't mean one person does it all and everybody else just sits around and watches them do it. We have all been called to share equally in the movement of this mission. See, we don't do this very naturally, though. Humans, no, we don't. This unity thing, we're not real good at it, are we?